I feel that even after all these years, every time that I'm in front of an actual Piero object, in front of one of his paintings, that I'm seeing him with completely fresh eyes. And that was one of the most wonderful, if not the most moving experience of co-curating the exhibition in Washington this past year, which then moved on to the Uffizi, that seeing all of these old friends, all of these paintings that as a poor graduate student I was traveling the world to see everywhere from Ottawa to, in fact, most recently Sao Paulo, but that was one of the few places I didn't have a chance to visit. But also Stockholm and Paris and all over Italy, from Venice to Pesaro, and even to St. Petersburg, to actually see all of these works gathered in the same space, in this wonderful array of galleries, and seeing these works living together again, actually in ways that they hadn't for 5 centuries, since some of them were in the same room in Piero's own studio, was an extraordinary experience for me. And I understood them anew. I saw them differently, in a different light, quite literally, not just in terms of subject matter, but also in terms of the way that Piero manipulated color and used light in ways that I might not have thought about when I saw one painting next to another, especially in terms of kind of thinking about the whole arc of his career in terms of the youthful Piero and the mature artist and the aging artist, how he used color and his really masterful chromatic effects that even rivaled those of his Flemish contemporaries. So I feel like I'm still learning, which is a wonderful thing, and he's an endlessly, just boundlessly interesting and very mysterious artist. I think hence his draw today. It's certainly the reason why he was so celebrated in his own lifetime, but he was long overdue for the kind of treatment that I think he's received in the last, I would say, in the literature in the last 15 to 20 years, and just this past year with not one but 2 quite different exhibitions that I think exhibited his career and his creative language in different light. So in his own lifetime, he was really the equal of the likes of Sandro Botticelli and Domenico Ghirlandaio, and he was probably the most willing, the most intrepid follower of Leonardo in all of Florence. So in Milan, Leonardo had at least 12 or 13 very loyal, very faithful followers. Piero wouldn't have been considered a student of Leonardo, and he didn't copy any of his works, but he was really profoundly, I think, influenced by Leonardo's very difficult creative idiom. But Piero put his own accents on, I think, Leonardo's visual experiments. So in his own time, I think he was a pretty big deal. But I just mentioned Botticelli. Just like Botticelli, in all of the intervening centuries up to the pre-Raphaelites, or an artist who's certainly no less celebrated than Piero di Cosimo today, the other Piero, the older Piero, Piero della Francesca, he was more or less forgotten until Roberto Longhi resuscitated his reputation. And we can go down the line throughout the history of the visual arts and speak of artists like Chardin, for example, and closer to our own century, someone like Amedeo Modigliani, who really wasn't thought to be the kind of distinguished master that we treasure today. He was very much sidelined in the early 20th century. So I think there's a reason why now, in a lot of ways, I think maybe it's taken this long for not just art historians, but certainly the general public to understand how modern, in many ways, Piero's imagination and this really remarkable ability to leave a great deal of the creativity really on the part of the viewer rather than the painter, that there's so much open-endedness to his works, and I wouldn't say just the mythological or allegorical paintings, but even the narratives in his devotional works, there's always space for interpretation and new interpretation. He was very much valued and appreciated in his own lifetime, But again, time plays really interesting tricks with artists' reputations. And I mentioned, I think, Botticelli and Piero della Francesca. If there's any other artist that I would really pair with Piero as someone who was, the word would be astratezza, I guess, in following Giorgio Vasari's lead, someone who was kind of lost in thought, a bit abstracted, and someone almost in an obsessive sense, really interested in, for example, in Piero's case, as one could even say of Hieronymus Bosch, who can be almost kind of a twin Piero north of the Alps in Flanders, obsessed with animal life and nature and the painting of natural phenomenon, like sunrises and sunsets and storms and tempestuous skies. Someone who is very attentive to even changes in weather, to meteorological effects, like Hieronymus Bosch. I would say that that person in Florence as a precursor to Piero would be Paolo Uccello, who also very much, I think, deserves a new book, if not a new exhibition, even though he's left us very little, and his most celebrated cycle is a 3-panel cycle that's spread between 3 collections in the Louvre and the National Gallery in London and the Uffizi, the Battle of San Romano, and then there's the fresco cycle in Santa Maria Novella. So it would be very difficult to stage a show on Uccello, but one senses that in his own lifetime he also would have been an artist who was very much revered, if not treasured, and he worked for the most important Dominican church in all of Florence. He worked for the Bartolini family. He was certainly very well known to the Medici, and yet the decades and then the centuries passed, and it really wasn't until the early, I would say Bernard Berenson, and then the early 20th century, and then art historians like John Pope Hennessy, who really began to try and understand Paolo Uccello on his own terms. So time is fickle, and these are artists, again, Botticelli, Piero, Paolo Uccello, to this day I would say someone like Perugino and Fra Bartolomeo, all of whom I think really deserve not necessarily to be rediscovered, because they were never really undiscovered, they were never really forgotten, but just to think about them in new ways. I think that's extremely important, because we're dealing with artists who are very rich in their range of works and in their stylistic shifts and technical experimentation. And I think maybe it's also important to begin to maybe push against or pull away from these very strict definitions that we have used to categorize art of this period, that something is high Renaissance or something is proto-Renaissance or late medieval in the case of Giotto or Duccio or the Lorenzetti brothers, or I think the worst term of all, Mannerist, because one could say that Mantegna and Piero della Francesca are also proto-Mannerist painters. Actually, that was precisely the reason why Gretchen Hirschauer and I at the National Gallery, Virginia Brilliant, and Elizabeth Walmsley, we all thought that is precisely the reason why he does deserve to be seen with fresh eyes. And so to have all of these new technical studies that have actually almost kind of flowered from these 2 exhibitions with teams of conservators in Washington and in Florence and in Sao Paulo, with Karen Barbosa and Paolo Sanucci in Rome. It's been just so exciting to me that just in the span of the 6 or 7 years, which now in retrospect sounds like a very long time, that we've been planning these 2 twin exhibitions in the U.S. and Italy, that we know so much more about not just the condition of these works, but the creative process. We now have a window into the way that Piero actually ideated a composition and a drawing. There are about 6 or so sketches that still survive. There are very few drawings that remain, and they were virtually all exhibited in the Uffizi show, along with those of his followers and artists in his orbit, like Lorenzo di Credi, for example, and Fra Bartolomeo. From the ideation stage to the drawing stage to the under-drawing stage on a panel, and then of course to the final oil glazes that we see today, and then even more questions and answers that have sprung from all of these technical studies in terms of the changes that Piero then made, and that Pontormo in the same years and the decades to follow would make almost religiously that he was never satisfied with the very first solution. So my interest at present is I think really focused, not exclusively, but in large part, on this question of process, of artistic process and artistic practice, the question of how, not just what an artist paints or who he or she is executing something for, but the step-by-step process, and also all of the editing, all of the revision, all of the brainstorming, all of the changes that an artist makes as they're settling on the final choice. Before we end, I also have to just express my enthusiasm for this project, for this website, for this video project, because we've spoken quite a bit about the two exhibitions in the National Gallery of Art and in the Uffizi, and as seemingly comprehensive as they were, between the two exhibitions, virtually every one of his 50 plus paintings and 30 some odd drawings were available to the public. But even then, there's some works that simply cannot travel and unfortunately never will be able to travel. And maybe it's not so unfortunate, because really in every case it's for reasons of conservation. And so there are some absolute gems that were not included in the two shows, like the fantasy portrait of Simonetta Vespucci, who's also been interpreted by some scholars as Cleopatra. So yet another very ambiguous, mysterious image that certainly deserves still more attention in the future and may never be resolved, but would have been wonderful to see by the general public in an exhibition setting. But again, for technical reasons, couldn't leave the Musée Condé in Chantilly and the Mars and Venus with Cupid from Berlin. So having them at least virtually available, and better yet, to be part of this kind of career trajectory of Piero's on a website, when you can pull up maybe 2 images at a time, or compare images that would have lived in the same palace or would have been produced in the same decade, I think is very valuable, especially for students.